I first noticed her in the kind of quiet moment that makes you forget breathing is optional. She was leaning over the counter at the cafe, sunlight spilling over her hair in slow, golden strands, and somehow, she made the ordinary seem impossible to ignore. My stomach twisted before I even understood why. She was older than me, mid-40s, confident in a way that wasn't loud or brash, but precise, like someone who knew exactly who she was and didn't need permission to exist. There was a subtle vulnerability behind her eyes, though, like she carried little fractures she never named out loud. And maybe that's what drew me in. I wasn't used to people who both guarded themselves and offered something soft enough to notice if you were paying attention. I was 23, maybe too young to understand everything, but not too young to feel the pull. Standing behind the counter, pretending to organize sugar packets, I caught her glance once, just long enough for the air between us to thicken, for my hand to brush hers while I handed her the coffee she didn't even seem to want but couldn't refuse. Her fingers lingered for a second that felt like a conversation without words. The smell of her perfume was subtle, cedar and something warmer I couldn't name, and it wrapped around me like a whisper. She smiled, almost shyly, and the corners of her lips turned up like she knew a joke only I might get. But when our eyes met again, the smile faltered, and that faint tremor in her posture, the tiniest shift of her weight, the way her shoulders stiffened, told me she wasn't just charming, she was holding something back. "Here," I said, voice quieter than I meant, and her gaze flicked down to the cup. Our fingers brushed again, more deliberately this time. My pulse caught. It was absurd, of course, but it was real. The warmth of her hand, the way she hesitated just long enough before pulling away, it was already memorized. She moved closer, leaning against the edge of the counter, hair brushing my arm, and the cafe noises dimmed into a kind of hum around us. I didn't know if she noticed how close I was, or if she did and allowed it anyway. That ambiguity became a dangerous kind of comfort. Every glance, every pause between words, was a conversation I couldn't speak out loud but understood in full. "You're quiet," she said softly, tilting her head. Her voice wasn't teasing, it was a question hanging in the air like smoke. I wanted to answer honestly, to tell her that she made me forget how to talk, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, letting the silence speak. She smiled again, small, almost imperceptible, and my stomach did a half flip. I noticed the way her fingers drummed lightly on the counter as if keeping time with something invisible. I noticed the slight tremor when she reached for her bag. Every detail was alive, every movement weighted with unspoken things. I couldn't stop watching, even knowing I shouldn't. And then the door opened. A bell tinkled, sharp and sudden, and her head turned with a flicker of irritation, or maybe surprise. Our hands had barely touched for long enough to notice the warmth, and now something intruded, external, abrupt. She glanced back at me, eyes sharp for just a fraction of a second, and I realized I hadn't even caught her name yet. But somehow, that didn't matter. The air between us still hummed, charged, unresolved. And for the first time that day, I wondered if she felt it too. I couldn't stop thinking about her after that day. Even in the quiet of my small apartment, her presence lingered in the back of my mind, the faint cedar warmth of her perfume, the way her eyes seemed to measure everything about me, even the things I tried to hide. She had a quiet elegance, yes, but I started noticing the hints of solitude beneath it. The way she lingered a little too long over her coffee, staring out the window as if she were searching for someone, or maybe waiting for something she'd already lost. Her fingers, always restless, betrayed a restlessness I didn't dare ask about. I imagined a life behind that careful composure, a marriage that didn't last, friends who drifted away, moments of regret she tucked into the folds of her days. And yet, she carried it all with a kind of understated strength, like someone who had learned to survive without asking for comfort. For me, it was simpler, I was inexperienced in the ways she had lived. I had crushes before, moments of infatuation, but nothing that made my chest ache with both desire and guilt. Because she was older. Because she was untouchable in ways I couldn't even articulate. There was a risk in noticing her, a social invisibility to consider, a line I wasn't sure I should cross. And still, every time she leaned close, when her shoulder brushed mine accidentally, or when her breath seemed to linger near my ear during a quiet conversation, I felt drawn in deeper. I noticed the small contradictions in her movements, the hesitations that told stories she wouldn't speak aloud. A hand resting too long on the counter while she poured sugar, a subtle tilt of her head when she asked the question, a lingering glance that she quickly masked. I tried not to notice, but I did anyway. Every detail felt amplified, as if the room itself bent around her presence. She noticed me noticing. I could feel it in the way her eyes held mine just a second too long, a charged weight in the silence between words. Yet she always pulled back, reminding me of the unspoken boundaries we were teetering along. A subtle tilt of her chin, a slight retreat when I wanted to step closer, tiny, perfect gestures that both tormented and enthralled me. And then there was the touch. Brief, almost accidental, her hand brushing against my shoulder as she leaned over to read a menu, fingers lingering for just a heartbeat. The air between us seemed to pulse in response. I didn't move away. She didn't either. Instead, we held the pause, an invisible acknowledgement that something had shifted, something neither of us could name yet. It was reckless in a quiet way. We both knew it. The age gap, the social eyes that might judge, the risks of entanglement, but none of that mattered in that moment. There was a spark there, unspoken but undeniable, a charge in the air that made every mundane detail feel sacred. And as she finally stepped back, letting the distance grow again, her eyes caught mine just long enough to whisper a question I couldn't hear. Did I feel it too? I did. I knew I did. The cafe was quieter than usual that afternoon, the kind of silence that made every movement feel louder, sharper. She leaned over the counter again, explaining something about a book she had just bought, her voice soft but deliberate. I caught the faint tremor in her fingers as she set the cup down in front of me, a small betrayal of control she tried to mask with a smile. I was close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her, the subtle scent of her perfume brushing my senses, but not close enough to touch her properly. And yet, our proximity made it impossible to ignore the tension curling between us, thick enough to taste. Then the door swung open. A friend of hers, laughing and oblivious, almost caught the intimacy in the way we hovered near one another. She straightened abruptly, adjusting her scarf, and I pretended to check my phone, heart hammering. The friend waved, and the moment passed, but the near exposure left a residue of heat that neither of us could shake. We returned to silence. Small glances. Quick breaths. A brush of her hand against mine as she passed behind me to reach for something. My chest tightened with every inch she closed. The world shrank to the narrow space between us, each heartbeat loud, each pause heavy with the possibility of crossing a line we both feared and craved. Her eyes caught mine, and for a fraction of a second, the air between us seemed electric. We were leaning closer than we should have been, faces just shy of a whisper apart. I wanted to close the gap. I wanted to feel the press of her lips, even for a fleeting instant, but fear kept my hands still. Social norms, her life, my own inexperience, every caution screamed at me, yet I couldn't pull away. "Do you always notice these things?" she murmured, voice low, almost hidden under the hum of the cafe. She tilted her head, as if daring me to answer honestly. I didn't. My eyes flicked to her lips for just a heartbeat, and then back to her eyes, which held a storm of unspoken thought. A text buzzed in my pocket, sudden and mundane, but it yanked me back from the edge of what could have been. She noticed my pause, smiled faintly, almost ruefully, as if we both knew the moment had slipped through our fingers again. And yet, the electricity remained, a residue in the charged air. We lingered like that for a while, too close, too aware of every subtle movement, every half-breathed word. When she finally stepped back, just enough to restore appearances, I realized our shoulders were still brushing. Fingers had grazed. Breath had mingled. And in that silent acknowledgement, we were closer than ever, even as our minds screamed to retreat. I wanted to tell her everything, to collapse into the truth of how drawn I was, but instead, I just let the tension hold, letting her gaze linger on mine a fraction too long. And in that pause, the unspoken promise stretched taut between us, ready to snap, yet held by mutual restraint. It was late when she invited me over, though she didn't say why. The apartment smelled faintly of vanilla and something sharper, something personal, like her presence had seeped into every corner. I hung my coat and tried to pretend I wasn't aware of every small detail, the way her hair fell across her shoulder, the subtle curve of her neck exposed when she tilted her head. We stood too close, and for the first time, the restraint felt unbearable. Her hand brushed mine while she reached for a book, and it lingered just long enough for me to notice the warmth, the softness, the way her fingers twitched as if holding back a confession. My chest thudded too loud in my own ears. I don't usually do this," she said, voice trembling just slightly, though she tried to hide it behind a careful smile. She didn't need to explain, I understood. Desire and fear were tangled in her every movement. She had always been composed, confident, but now she was something else entirely, raw in a way I'd only glimpsed before. I moved closer, the space between us collapsing inch by inch. My hand hovered near her cheek, my fingers itching to brush the hair away from her face. She leaned, almost imperceptibly, into my reach. I could feel the faint heat of her shoulder, the subtle rise and fall of her chest, and every nerve in my body ached to close the gap. "You know, you make it impossible," I murmured, my voice low, almost swallowed by the charged air. My lips hovered near her ear, and I could feel the tremor in her body before she could control it. She didn't pull back. She didn't stop me. She just let herself be caught in that moment, letting me see the vulnerability beneath her careful composure. Her eyes searched mine, a mixture of desire and hesitation, as if asking permission she wasn't sure she deserved. My hand brushed a stray lock of hair from her temple, fingertips lingering against the warmth of her skin. Every second stretched, taut with tension, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. Then she spoke, voice barely audible, yet sharp in its intimacy. I shouldn't feel this way." "I know," I whispered, almost painfully, feeling the magnetic pull that neither of us could resist. "But we do." Her breath caught, and for a heartbeat, everything froze, the hum of the city outside, the soft rustle of her clothes, the quiet of her apartment. We were poised on the edge, closer than we had ever been, and every instinct screamed for me to lean in, to close that last fraction of distance. And then, a sudden knock at the door shattered the spell. She jerked back just slightly, but her hand stayed on mine, fingers tightening in a silent, impossible promise. The moment hung suspended, unresolved, a kiss almost happening, a confession almost spoken, and neither of us knew how long we could survive the tension that now pulsed like a live wire between us. The knock at the door lingered in my mind long after it had gone. But when I returned to the cafe the next day, nothing could prepare me for the revelation that awaited. She was there, but not alone. A mutual friend hovered near, chatting casually, but the way her eyes darted toward me, sharp and unsettled, made my pulse spike. I didn't know you'd see me here," she said quietly when the friend finally wandered off, voice a touch too bright, too clipped. But it wasn't her words, it was the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers pressed against the edge of the table, as if grounding herself against something volatile. I realized, in a slow burn, that someone had overheard. Someone knew more than they should have. Her presence, usually so composed, flickered with an unspoken panic. She stepped closer to me, but her hand brushed mine with tremor, and she pulled away almost immediately, leaving both heat and distance in the space between. My own hands itched to reach out, to steady her, to claim the connection that suddenly felt exposed and dangerous. "I shouldn't have," she began, but stopped, eyes darting away, lips parting slightly as if seeking the right words. The pause was electric. I could feel her breath on my skin without touching, the subtle sway of her body betraying the controlled grace she usually carried. Every small motion, shoulder shifting, hair brushing cheek, the nervous tapping of her fingers, spoke volumes she refused to say aloud. I stepped closer anyway, just enough for our knees to brush under the table, and the friction was immediate, a spark that refused to die. "What happened?" I asked, trying to sound casual, failing entirely. My voice was low, near her ear, and I noticed the shiver that ran through her frame, quick and almost imperceptible. Someone overheard me, and," her voice caught. She finally met my gaze, and there it was, something raw, unfiltered, the kind of confession that didn't need words. The vulnerability, the desire, the panic of exposure, all laid bare in the way she leaned slightly into me before jerking back, like a moth drawn to flame but terrified of getting too close. I swallowed hard, heart racing. Every instinct screamed to close the distance, to claim what we'd only danced around until now, but the risk was sharper than ever. The attraction that had been my secret, my quiet obsession, now teetered on the edge of public exposure. And yet, the danger made it irresistible. "Then, we have to decide," I said finally, voice barely above a whisper, letting the words hang, letting the electricity linger. My fingers brushed her hand again, intentionally this time, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she let the contact last, just enough to promise that the line we were treading had shifted. For the first time, the rules we had been dancing around, age, perception, propriety, felt less important than the pull between us. And as her eyes caught mine, wide and unflinching despite the fear, I knew that nothing would stop us from reaching that inevitable turning point.